When Isabella Rodriguez inherited her grandmother's crumbling farmhouse in Cedar Ridge Township, the entire town erupted in laughter. The struggling single mother was already working double shifts at the local diner while cleaning offices at night, barely keeping her 9-year-old son fed and housed. The dilapidated property, with its sagging roof and collapsing barn, seemed like fate's cruelest joke. Her wealthy ex-husband's family called it worthless garbage. The bank threatened immediate foreclosure. Even her son's classmates mocked their new haunted house. But Isabella saw something different in those weathered wooden walls, a chance to give her boy the stability they desperately needed. What none of them knew was that hidden beneath decades of neglect lay documents and inventions that would change everything. Her grandmother hadn't left her a burden, she'd left her a fortune worth $100 million. But would Isabella discover the secret before the ruthless corporate developers, circling like hungry wolves, seized everything she held dear? The 4:30 a.m. alarm clock pierced through the thin walls of the one-bedroom apartment Isabella Rodriguez called home. Though calling it home felt generous for the cramped space above Murphy's hardware store on Elm Street. At 29, Isabella looked like she was pushing 40, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working 16-hour days while raising a 9-year-old son completely alone. The ancient coffee maker sputtered to life, producing the bitter brew that had become her lifeline through countless difficult mornings over the past 3 years since her divorce. "Mom, my backpack strap broke again," came the sleepy voice from the living room where her son Diego slept on a pull-out couch that doubled as their dining area during the day. At 9 years old, Diego possessed his mother's determination and his absent father's quick intelligence, a combination that filled Isabella with both fierce pride and constant worry about providing him with the opportunities he deserved. Isabella knelt beside the couch, examining the frayed strap that had finally given up after months of makeshift repairs with duct tape and safety pins. "We'll fix it with some strong thread before school," she said, though they both knew it was another Band-Aid solution to problems that required money they simply didn't have. The refrigerator hummed laboriously in the corner, struggling to keep fresh their modest groceries: generic cereal, day-old bread from the discount bakery, and the free lunch program applications that had become a necessity rather than a choice. Isabella's 3 jobs, morning shift at Rosie's Diner, afternoon house cleaning for wealthy families in Willowbrook Heights, and evening data entry for Henderson Insurance, barely covered their basic expenses while leaving her perpetually exhausted and emotionally drained. "Mrs. Murphy said we need to talk about the rent situation," Diego said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that children develop when they've learned to protect their parents from additional stress. Old Martha Murphy, who owned the hardware store below and their apartment above, had been patient about late payments, but Isabella could see the growing concern in the woman's weathered face every time they crossed paths. Isabella's jaw clenched as she prepared Diego's lunch: peanut butter sandwich with the crusts cut off the way he liked, an apple that had seen better days, and a juice box that would have to satisfy his afternoon thirst. "Don't worry about Mrs. Murphy. We'll figure something out." But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, knowing that the stack of bills on their kitchen counter told a different story entirely. Overdue electric bill, $347. Water and sewer, $89 past due. Car insurance, $156, 3 days from cancellation. The medical bills from Diego's emergency appendectomy 6 months ago, $4,847, growing larger each month with late fees and interest charges that seemed designed to crush families like theirs into permanent debt. Isabella had already sold her engagement ring, her grandmother's silver jewelry, and every item of value they'd once owned, yet the mountain of obligations continued growing faster than her ability to chip away at it. The phone rang with its shrill, urgent tone that had come to signal nothing but bad news. Isabella glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. Thornfield and Associates. The law firm representing her ex-husband's family never called with good intentions. "Isabella Rodriguez speaking," she answered, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Jennifer Walsh from Thornfield and Associates. We need to schedule an immediate meeting regarding Diego's living arrangements. My clients, the Blackwood family, have growing concerns about the stability you're providing for their grandson. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of her former in-laws' judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Harrison and Victoria Blackwood had built a pharmaceutical empire worth hundreds of millions and had never allowed anyone to forget their superior position in life's hierarchy. They'd barely tolerated Isabella when she was married to their son, a marriage that had imploded when she discovered his cocaine addiction and chronic infidelity. But since the divorce, they'd made their feelings crystal clear through subtle threats wrapped in concern for Diego's welfare.
"Diego is perfectly fine where he is," Isabella said firmly, watching her son organize his school supplies with the methodical precision of a child who'd learned self-sufficiency out of necessity. Fine? Living above a hardware store? Attending public school? Wearing secondhand clothes? Isabella, we can provide opportunities that you simply cannot. Private tutoring, sailing lessons, preparation for the finest universities. We're offering Diego a future that matches his potential. The words stung precisely because they contained enough truth to cut deeply. Isabella had been wrestling with the same thoughts during sleepless nights, wondering if her stubborn pride was preventing Diego from accessing advantages that could transform his life trajectory. The Blackwoods could offer him everything: elite education, international travel, connections that opened doors she couldn't even imagine. But every time she considered their barely concealed ultimatum, she remembered her grandmother's dying words. "Mija, never let them make you feel small. You are stronger than you know, and Diego needs his mother more than he needs their money." "I'm his mother," Isabella said quietly but firmly. "Are you? Or are you just a woman too proud to admit when she's been beaten by circumstances beyond her control?" After ending the call, Isabella sat in her dented Honda Civic outside Diego's elementary school, staring at the certified letter that had arrived 5 days ago. The legal document bore the impressive letterhead of Morrison and Associates, estate attorneys, but the message was surprisingly straightforward. Her grandmother Elena Rodriguez had passed away 3 months ago, and after settling debts and legal fees, Isabella had inherited a farmhouse on 18 acres in Cedar Ridge Township. The inheritance came with substantial complications, back taxes totaling $23,000, no functioning utilities, and a structure that the county building inspector had charitably described as requiring comprehensive renovation to meet basic habitability standards. Isabella had driven out to examine the property only once, and the sight had nearly shattered what remained of her optimism. The farmhouse sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, its roof patched with tarps and mismatched shingles, the front porch supported by makeshift wooden posts that looked ready to collapse at the slightest provocation. The barn had lost most of its roof to weather and time, while the fields had surrendered to weeds, volunteer trees, and the kind of wild overgrowth that suggested nature was actively reclaiming the land. To any reasonable observer, the property represented exactly what it appeared to be: a financial burden that would consume whatever resources she could scrape together while providing nothing in return. But as Isabella had walked through the empty rooms, breathing air thick with dust and memories, she'd felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. The house possessed good bones beneath its weathered exterior: solid oak floors, hand-hewn beams, and stone foundations that had withstood decades of harsh Iowa winters. More importantly, she'd remembered her grandmother's hands, always busy with some project, always finding ways to create beauty and functionality from whatever materials were available. Elena Rodriguez had been a dreamer and a fighter, the kind of woman who saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles. She'd raised 6 children in this house while helping her husband run a small farming operation, and somehow managed to send 3 of them to college on savings earned through relentless hard work and careful planning. "Every problem has a solution," Elena used to say, "but sometimes you have to look at it sideways to see what God intended." The school bell rang, jolting Isabella back to the present as children began streaming out of Riverside Elementary. She spotted Diego immediately. He moved through the crowd with the confident independence of a child who'd learned to navigate the world largely on his own. He climbed into the Honda with his characteristic bright smile, the one that reminded her why she fought so hard every single day. "How was school, my love?" Isabella asked, starting the engine and hoping it would turn over without the grinding noise that had been growing worse each week. "Good. Mrs. Patterson said my science project about renewable energy was the best in the class. She wants to submit it to the district competition." Diego's enthusiasm was infectious, his eyes bright with the kind of intellectual curiosity that made Isabella's heart swell with pride, even as she worried about nurturing his gifts on their limited budget. They drove through downtown Cedar Ridge, past the establishments that had become waypoints in their struggle for financial survival. The pawn shop where Isabella had reluctantly sold her grandmother's antique clock, the check-cashing service that took a percentage of every paycheck in exchange for immediate access to funds, the discount grocery store where she'd learned to make $15 stretch across a week's worth of meals through careful planning and creative cooking. "Mom," Diego said as they pulled into the hardware store parking lot, "what's a worthless dump?" Isabella's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as anger flashed through her exhaustion. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "Sophia Blackwood told everyone at recess that her grandparents said we inherited a worthless dump. She said they might buy it from us for cheap and bulldoze it to build something useful."
Uncertainty in her privileged 8 years of life. The casual cruelty was particularly painful because it reflected adult conversations that should never have reached children's ears, demonstrating how the wealthy discuss the struggles of others as entertainment or opportunity. "It's not a worthless dump," Isabella said carefully, choosing her words to protect Diego's feelings while being honest about their situation. "It's your great-grandmother's house, the place where I spent summers as a little girl, learning about gardening and cooking and fixing things that were broken." Diego considered this information with the gravity he brought to all adult subjects. "Are we going to live there?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that Isabella had been avoiding for weeks. Moving to the farmhouse would mean leaving their current support system, Diego's school, Isabella's jobs, the familiar rhythms of survival they'd established in town. It would mean gambling their limited resources on a property that might consume everything they had while providing nothing in return. But it would also mean escaping the suffocating pressure of rent payments, utility bills, and the constant fear of eviction that had dominated their lives for 3 years. It would mean giving Diego space to run and explore, fresh air instead of the exhaust fumes that drifted up from Elm Street, and perhaps most importantly, it would mean removing him from the immediate sphere of influence of grandparents who viewed their poverty as evidence of moral failure. "Maybe," Isabella said finally, the word carrying more hope than certainty. "It would be a big change, and a lot of hard work." "I like hard work," Diego replied with the confidence of someone who'd been contributing to household tasks since he was old enough to fold laundry. "And I could have a real bedroom instead of the couch." That evening, after Diego had completed his homework and settled in for the night, Isabella sat at their small kitchen table, surrounded by bills, calculator, legal documents, and a cup of coffee that had grown cold while she wrestled with numbers that refused to balance. The inheritance letter lay beside a notebook where she'd been calculating the minimum requirements for making the farmhouse habitable: new roof, electrical updates, plumbing repairs, heating system installation. Even the most conservative estimates reached figures that made her head spin with their impossibility. Her savings account held exactly $127 after covering Diego's school lunch money for the week. Her checking account showed a balance of -$43, kept from triggering overdraft fees only by her careful timing of deposits and withdrawals. The 3 jobs provided enough income to cover their current minimal expenses, but left absolutely no margin for the kind of investment that the farmhouse would require to become livable. The inheritance papers included a set of old brass keys that looked like they belonged in a historical museum, along with a note from the estate attorney explaining that the property had been in the Rodriguez family for nearly a century. Elena had been the last surviving member of her generation, a woman who devoted her later years to tending the farmhouse and pursuing what neighbors diplomatically called projects in the barn and various outbuildings. Isabella remembered visiting the farmhouse during childhood summers, recalled her grandmother's workshop filled with mysterious contraptions and half-finished inventions that seemed to defy easy explanation. Elena had been endlessly curious about how things worked, radios, engines, electrical systems, and had possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles that had sometimes resulted in improvements to equipment that supposedly couldn't be improved. The phone rang again, interrupting Isabella's financial calculations. This time, the caller ID showed Elizabeth Blackwood, her former sister-in-law and the one member of Marcus's family who had maintained civil relations after the divorce. "Isabella, I hope I'm not calling too late," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying genuine warmth that had always distinguished her from the rest of the Blackwood clan. "Not at all, Elizabeth. How are you?" "Worried about you and Diego, honestly. My parents are talking about getting more aggressive with their custody efforts, and I wanted to give you a heads up. They've hired investigators to document your living conditions and financial situation." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Private investigators meant the Blackwoods were escalating beyond mere legal pressure toward active surveillance and intimidation. What kind of documentation? The kind that builds cases about inadequate housing, unstable employment, inability to provide educational opportunities. "Isabella, they're scared that Diego is slipping away from their influence, and they're prepared to use every resource at their disposal to change that." "What do you think I should do?" Isabella asked, grateful for Elizabeth's honesty even as the information terrified her. "I think Diego needs his mother, but I also think you need to understand what you're up against. They have unlimited resources and connections throughout the legal system. If you're going to fight them, you need to be strategic about it." After Elizabeth hung up, Isabella walked to the window overlooking Elm Street, watching late-night traffic navigate the potholes that the city council had been promising to repair for 3 years. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls seeming to press inward as she contemplated the forces arrayed against her family's unity.
She thought about her grandmother's hands again, remembered how Elena could fix anything that was broken, could find creative solutions to problems that stumped everyone else. "Mija," her grandmother used to say, "sometimes the answer is hiding right in front of you, but you have to clean away the dust before you can see it clearly." Maybe it was time to clean away the dust. Maybe it was time to bet everything on the possibility that Elena Rodriguez had left them more than just problems and debt. Maybe those weathered farmhouse walls held secrets that could change their lives in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The inheritance might be a burden, but it was also the only chance Diego had of growing up free from the Blackwoods' suffocating control. Tomorrow, Isabella would make a decision that would either save their small family or destroy what little stability they'd managed to build. But tonight, sitting in the dim light of their tiny kitchen, with unpaid bills spread across the table like accusatory evidence of her failures, Isabella Rodriguez allowed herself to hope that her grandmother's final gift might be exactly what they needed to survive. The morning would bring new challenges, difficult choices, and the beginning of a journey that would test every assumption she'd made about what was possible when a woman refused to give up on the people she loved most. Diego deserved better than a life spent running from creditors and cowering before wealthy bullies who viewed his mother's struggles as entertainment. Elena Rodriguez had been a fighter, and she'd raised Isabella to be one too. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The December morning that would change Isabella's life forever began with a phone call from Thornfield and Associates that shattered any illusion of safety she'd managed to maintain. Jennifer Walsh's voice carried the cold precision of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez, my clients have completed their preliminary assessment of Diego's living situation. They're prepared to file for emergency custody modification unless you agree to voluntary placement within their household by January 15th. Isabella's coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as the implications hit her like a physical blow. Emergency custody modification meant they had evidence, or claimed to have evidence, that Diego was in immediate danger under her care. It was the nuclear option, designed to bypass normal custody procedures and grant immediate control to grandparents who could afford the best lawyers money could buy. "You can't do that," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I'm a good mother. Diego is healthy, happy, doing well in school." Mrs. Rodriguez, a child sleeping on a pull-out couch in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, whose mother works 16-hour days and relies on free lunch programs, is not living in conditions that meet basic standards for child welfare. Add in the mounting debt, the threat of eviction, and what my clients view as your stubborn refusal to accept help. Walsh's pause was calculated for maximum impact. Well, any judge would have serious concerns. After ending the call, Isabella sat among the pieces of broken ceramic, staring at the inheritance papers that had been sitting on her counter for 2 weeks like an accusation of her own indecision. The Blackwoods had forced her hand. The farmhouse wasn't just an option anymore. It was her only chance of keeping Diego. She called in sick to the diner for the first time in 8 months, picked Diego up early from school with a fabricated story about a family emergency, and drove towards Cedar Ridge Township with her heart hammering against her ribs. The December landscape was bleak and unforgiving, brown fields stretching towards gray horizons under a sky that threatened snow. "Where are we going, Mom?" Diego asked, pressing his face against the window as familiar neighborhoods gave way to rural highways lined with bare trees and weathered farmhouses. "To see your great-grandmother's house," Isabella replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "To see if it's really as impossible as everyone says it is." The farmhouse looked even worse in the harsh winter light than it had during her brief visit in October. The roof sagged in 3 distinct places where structural supports had failed, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. The front porch listed dramatically to the left, supported by a collection of salvaged lumber that formed a makeshift framework of questionable stability. But Diego saw something different. He climbed out of the Honda and approached the house with the careful steps of an explorer discovering new territory, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air as he examined the weathered stone foundation and the tall windows that had been designed to capture maximum sunlight. "It's huge," Diego said, his voice filled with wonder rather than dismay. "It's falling apart," Isabella replied, but there was no real conviction in her voice as she watched her son trace the intricate carved details on the porch railings with fingers that showed reverence rather than judgment. They walked around the property together, mother and son taking inventory of both the damage and the possibilities. The barn was in worse condition than the house, its roof partially collapsed and its walls leaning at angles that defied physics. But the workshop behind the main house had weathered the years with more dignity, its thick stone walls and slate roof having protected whatever lay inside from decades of neglect. The front door opened with surprising ease, revealing rooms that were larger and better proportioned than Isabella remembered from childhood visits. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through grimy windows, illuminating hardwood floors that were scarred but structurally sound. The living room featured a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires, but its chimney still straight and true. "Mom, look at this," Diego called from what had once been the kitchen. Isabella found him standing before a huge cast-iron stove that looked like it belonged in a museum, running his small hands over its ornate surface with obvious fascination. "Does it still work?" Isabella examined the stove more closely, noting that someone, presumably her grandmother, had maintained it carefully, despite the general decay of the house. The firebox was clean, the dampers moved freely, and the cooking surfaces showed signs of recent use. "I think it might," she said, surprised by her own words. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, testing each step carefully as they explored bedrooms that revealed the house's original grandeur. The master bedroom featured windows on 3 sides that looked out over fields and distant hills, while the smaller bedrooms had been arranged to catch morning light and evening breezes. In what had clearly been a child's room, Diego discovered built-in bookshelves and a window seat that faced the old oak tree in the backyard.
I could read here, Diego said quietly, settling onto the dusty cushions with an expression of contentment that Isabella hadn't seen in months. I could watch birds and read all the books I want. As they explored the house room by room, Isabella found herself seeing past the surface decay to the bones of something magnificent. The electrical system was ancient but appeared functional. The plumbing was simple but adequate, and the heating system consisted of beautiful cast-iron radiators connected to a boiler that might be coaxed back to life with some mechanical attention. More importantly, she began to understand why her grandmother had loved this place enough to live here alone for decades. The house possessed a quality that was impossible to quantify, a sense of permanence and possibility that made the cramped apartment above Murphy's Hardware seem like a temporary way station rather than a home. "What do you think, my love?" Isabella asked Diego as they stood together in the living room, surrounded by dust and memories and the faint echo of generations who had built their lives within these walls. Diego looked up at his mother with eyes that held more hope than she'd seen since the divorce. "I think Great-Grandma Elena wanted us to fix it up. I think she saved it for us." That afternoon, as they drove back toward town, Isabella made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would cash out the small 401k she'd managed to accumulate during her marriage, use the money to pay the back taxes and essential repairs, and move them to the farmhouse before the Blackwoods could make good on their custody threats. It was a gamble with stakes she couldn't afford to lose, but it was better than surrendering without a fight. The next morning brought a succession of phone calls that would have been comical if the circumstances weren't so desperate. Isabella sat at her kitchen table with a notepad, making lists and calculations, while Diego ate breakfast and prepared for what might be one of his last days at Riverside Elementary. First call, Martha Murphy, their landlord. "Isabella, I hate to pressure you, but I need to know about January's rent. The property management company is asking questions, and I've been covering for you as long as I can." "Mrs. Murphy, I appreciate everything you've done for us. I'll have an answer for you by Friday." Second call, Rosie's Diner. "Honey, I need you to work a double today. Sarah called in sick and we're already short-staffed for the lunch rush." "I'm sorry, Rosie, but I need to take care of some family business today. I'll be back tomorrow." Third call, Dr. Martinez's office about Diego's outstanding medical bills. "Mrs. Rodriguez, we need to discuss payment arrangements for the balance on Diego's account. The hospital is considering turning this over to collections if we can't establish a schedule." "I understand. Let me call you back tomorrow with a plan." By 10 a.m., Isabella was driving towards Cedar Ridge Township again, this time with a manila folder full of documents, a measuring tape, and a notebook where she'd begun calculating the minimum requirements for making the farmhouse habitable. The December air was sharp and clean after the perpetual exhaust fumes of downtown, and she found herself breathing more deeply as she navigated the winding roads that led to her inheritance. The hardware store in Cedar Ridge was a revelation after the chain store she was accustomed to dealing with in town. Walsh & Sons Hardware occupied a converted barn on Main Street, its wide aisles stocked with everything from cast-iron pipe fittings to wood-burning stove accessories that would have been impossible to find elsewhere. "You must be Elena Rodriguez's granddaughter," said the man behind the counter, a weathered individual in his 60s who possessed the kind of practical knowledge that came from a lifetime of solving other people's problems. "I'm Bill Walsh. Your grandmother was one of our best customers, always working on some project or another." "I'm Isabella Rodriguez. I inherited her farmhouse, and I'm trying to figure out what it would take to make it livable again."
Bill's face lit up with the expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed challenging problems. "Elena's place, huh? I helped her with materials for that workshop she built behind the house. Solid construction, better than most modern buildings. What's your timeline?" "I need to move in by January 15th, Isabella said, the words sounding impossible even as she spoke them. Bill whistled low. "That's ambitious, but not impossible if you're willing to do most of the work yourself and focus on the essentials first. Heat, water, basic electrical safety, the fancy stuff can wait." For the next hour, Bill walked Isabella through a crash course in emergency home renovation, explaining which repairs were critical for habitability and which could be deferred until spring.
His estimates were far more reasonable than the contractor she'd contacted, partly because he assumed she would provide most of the labor herself. "The roof is your biggest problem," Bill explained, sketching rough diagrams on the back of a receipt. "But you don't need to replace the whole thing, just patch the worst sections and get it weatherproofed for winter. Come spring, you can tackle a proper renovation." How much would materials cost for a temporary fix? Maybe $800 if you stick to basics: tarps, roofing cement, some lumber for structural support where it's sagging. Not pretty, but it'll keep you dry. Isabella felt her first flutter of genuine hope since Jennifer Walsh's threatening phone call. $800 was still more than she had, but it was within the realm of possibility if she cashed out her 401k and managed the penalties and taxes carefully. What about heat? That old boiler system is probably salvageable. Might need some new pipes and radiators, new thermostat, basic maintenance. Elena kept it in better shape than most people would have. Maybe another $600 for parts if you do the installation work yourself. By the time Isabella left Walsh & Sons Hardware, she had a detailed plan for making the farmhouse minimally habitable within her desperately limited budget. It would require working every available hour between now and January 15th, learning skills she'd never needed before, and trusting that her grandmother's legacy was stronger than its surface appearance suggested. The afternoon brought another crucial phone call, this one to Henderson Insurance, where she'd been doing evening data entry for 18 months. "Mr. Henderson, this is Isabella Rodriguez. I need to ask about increasing my hours temporarily, maybe working some weekend shifts or taking on additional projects." "Actually, Isabella, I'm glad you called. We just landed a big contract that's going to require extra help with data processing. Boring work, but it pays well if you're interested in overtime." "Very interested. What kind of timeline?" "Next 6 weeks, probably. Evenings and weekends, as much as you can handle. Time and a half for anything over 40 hours. Isabella felt another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The extra income wouldn't solve all their problems, but it would provide the cash flow needed to cover basic supplies and utilities while she worked on the farmhouse renovation. That evening, she sat Diego down for the most important conversation of his young life. They were sitting on his pull-out couch bed, surrounded by the familiar sounds of downtown traffic and the comforting hum of Mrs. Murphy's television from downstairs. "Diego, we need to talk about some big changes that are coming." Her son looked up from his homework with the serious expression he wore when dealing with adult complications. "Are we moving to Great-Grandma's house?" "Maybe. Would you be okay with that?" "Would I have my own room?" "Yes, you'd have your own room. But it would mean leaving this apartment, and your school, and starting over somewhere new. It would mean a lot of hard work getting the house fixed up, and it might be uncomfortable for a while." Diego considered this information with the gravity that had become his trademark. "Would the Blackwoods leave us alone if we moved there?" Isabella was continually amazed by her son's perceptiveness. "I think they might. The farmhouse would be ours, completely ours. No landlord, no rent payments, no one who could make us leave." "Then I want to move there," Diego said, with the finality of someone who'd reached a decision based on clear priorities. "I want us to have our own place where nobody can boss us around." That night, after Diego had fallen asleep, Isabella sat at her kitchen table with paperwork spread around her like the components of a complicated puzzle. 401k withdrawal forms, utility transfer applications, school enrollment documents for Cedar Ridge Elementary, and a legal pad where she'd been calculating timelines and budgets with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. The numbers were terrifying and encouraging in equal measure. The 401k withdrawal would net approximately $3,200 after penalties and taxes, enough to cover back taxes, essential repairs, moving expenses, and a small buffer for unexpected problems. The extra work at Henderson Insurance would provide ongoing income while she established herself in Cedar Ridge Township. Most importantly, moving to the farmhouse would eliminate their largest monthly expense, rent, while providing Diego with the stability and space he needed to grow and thrive away from the Blackwoods' suffocating influence. The phone rang at 9:47 p.m., startling Isabella from her calculations. The caller ID showed Elizabeth Blackwood's number. "Isabella, I'm calling to warn you about something. My parents have scheduled a meeting with their attorneys tomorrow morning to discuss filing for emergency custody. They're convinced you're planning to flee the jurisdiction with Diego." "I'm not fleeing anywhere," Isabella said firmly. I'm making decisions that are best for my son's welfare. I believe you, but they don't. They view any change in your living situation as evidence of instability. If you're planning to move, you need to be very careful about how you handle it legally. What do you suggest? Document everything. Keep records of your income, your housing arrangements, Diego's school performance, his health records. Make sure any move you make is clearly in his best interests, not just a reaction to their pressure. After Elizabeth hung up, Isabella looked around the cramped apartment that had been their refuge for 3 years. It wasn't much, but it represented safety and familiarity in a world that often felt hostile to single mothers trying to build better lives for their children. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of leaving that safety behind and betting everything on her grandmother's legacy. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and absolutely necessary. She thought about Elena Rodriguez, alone in that big farmhouse for decades, tending her mysterious projects and maintaining hope that someday family would return to fill those empty rooms with laughter and purpose. Her grandmother had been a fighter, a dreamer, a woman who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. Maybe it was time for Isabella to discover whether she'd inherited more than just property from the remarkable woman who'd raised 6 children in that house while somehow finding time to tinker with inventions that nobody else understood. The farmhouse might be falling apart, but it was theirs. Diego would have his own room, space to run and explore, fresh air instead of exhaust fumes, and most importantly, freedom from the constant pressure of people who viewed their struggles as entertainment or opportunity. Tomorrow would begin the most challenging chapter of their lives, but also potentially the most rewarding. Elena Rodriguez had left them more than just a house. She'd left them a chance to build something beautiful from the ashes of what others had written off as worthless. Isabella fell asleep that night surrounded by planning documents and dreams of Diego running through those overgrown fields, finally free to be the brilliant, curious child he was meant to be. The first night in the farmhouse tested every ounce of determination Isabella possessed. The moving truck had departed that afternoon, leaving their modest belongings scattered across the living room like debris from a shipwreck. The electricity worked sporadically, creating an ominous flickering that made Diego nervous, while the water ran rust-colored for 20 minutes before clearing to a marginally acceptable brown tint. The heating system wheezed and clanked like a dying animal, producing barely enough warmth to take the edge of the January cold. "Mom, there's ice forming on the inside of my window," Diego called from upstairs, his voice echoing through the drafty house with an odd mixture of excitement and concern. Isabella climbed the creaking stairs with an armload of blankets and a portable space heater she'd bought at Walsh & Sons Hardware, finding her son standing in what would become his bedroom, watching frost crystals form intricate patterns on the glass. The room was beautiful in its proportions: high ceilings, built-in bookshelves, that wonderful window seat over the oak tree. But it was also brutally cold. "We'll get this figured out, my love," Isabella said, plugging in the space heater and arranging extra blankets on Diego's mattress, which sat directly on the floor until she could afford a proper bed frame. "Think of it as camping inside a house." "Camping is supposed to be fun," Diego replied, but he was smiling as he said it, still caught up in the adventure of having his own space for the first time in his life. As evening descended, they discovered just how isolated the farmhouse truly was. The nearest neighbor lived half a mile away, their lights barely visible through the bare trees that lined the property boundaries. The silence was profound after years of living above a busy street. No traffic, no sirens, no voices from adjacent apartments. Just the wind rattling the loose window frames and the occasional groan of old wood settling in the cold. Isabella had prepared a simple dinner on the ancient gas stove, which it required 15 minutes of coaxing and the careful application of matches to pilot lights that seemed determined to remain unlit. They ate by candlelight in the kitchen, not for romance, but because the overhead fixture had shorted out in a shower of sparks that left them temporarily in darkness. "Mom, what if we made a mistake?" Diego asked quietly, picking at his macaroni and cheese while wrapped in a heavy coat that made him look like a tiny Arctic explorer. The question hit Isabella harder than she expected, because she'd been wrestling with the same doubt since the moment they'd locked the door of their apartment for the final time. 12 hours ago, they'd had electricity that worked reliably, heat that kept them comfortable, and neighbors close enough to hear if they called for help. Now they were sitting in a barely habitable house, eating by candlelight, and listening to strange noises that could have been settling timbers or structural collapse. "I don't know," Isabella admitted, choosing honesty over false reassurance. "Maybe we did. But even if we made a mistake, we made it together, and we can fix it together." That night they slept in the living room near the fireplace, which Isabella had managed to coax into producing actual heat after several failed attempts and a near disaster involving too much newspaper and not enough kindling. Diego's sleeping bag was spread on the old sofa, while Isabella had to do with blankets on the hardwood floor. The fire provided warmth and comfort, but also highlighted just how much work lay ahead of them. After the fire, the sheets were thin. The morning brought gray skies and a sobering inventory of immediate problems. The bathroom faucet had frozen overnight, leaving them without running water. The refrigerator, which had seemed to be working yesterday, was now making ominous grinding noises that suggested imminent mechanical failure. And the roof leak that had seemed manageable during their initial inspection had worsened dramatically, requiring 3 strategically placed buckets to catch the steady drip of melting ice. "Good morning, campers," Isabella said with forced cheerfulness as Diego emerged from his cocoon of blankets looking rumpled but remarkably good-natured for someone who'd spent his first night in a house that seemed determined to test their resolve. "Are we going to fix the water today?" he asked, demonstrating the practical focus that had become his survival strategy. "We're going to try," Isabella replied, though her experience with plumbing was limited to unclogging bathroom drains in their old apartment. The phone rang, a landline that Elena had maintained and that Isabella had decided to keep rather than rely on spotty cell service in the rural area. The caller ID showed Walsh & Sons Hardware, and Isabella felt a flutter of hope that help might be available. "Isabella, this is Bill Walsh. How was your first night?" "Educational," Isabella replied diplomatically. "We're learning about the difference between theory and practice when it comes to old houses." Bill's laugh was worn and understanding. "I figured you might run into some surprises. Listen, I'm heading out to the Patterson place this morning to help with a furnace repair, and your grandmother's house is right on my way. Mind if I stop by and take a look at whatever's giving you trouble?" Within an hour, Bill's pickup truck was parked in the farmhouse driveway, and the man himself was crawling around the basement with a flashlight and a toolbox, muttering things like, "Well, there's your problem," and "Haven't seen one of these in 20 years. "Your main issue is that Elena winterized this place for someone who wasn't planning to live here," Bill explained as he emerged from the basement covered in dust and spiderwebs. "She shut down systems that you need running, and some of the pipes aren't insulated properly for occupied heating." For the next 3 hours, Bill transformed their dire situation into merely challenging circumstances. He showed Isabella how to properly light the boiler, explained the quirks of the electrical system, and performed emergency repairs on the frozen pipes that restored running water to the kitchen and bathroom. "This house has good bones," Bill said as he packed up his tools. "Elena knew how to maintain things properly, but she was living here like it was a summer cottage instead of a year-round home. You'll need to make some adjustments, but nothing that can't be handled with time and patience." "How much do I owe you?" Isabella asked, reaching for her purse with the resignation of someone prepared to part with money she couldn't afford to spend. "Nothing today," Bill replied, waving off her offer. "Elena Rodriguez was a good customer and a good neighbor. Consider this a welcome to the community gesture. But if you need more help down the road, we can work out something reasonable." After Bill left, Isabella found herself in the kitchen making actual coffee on a stove that now worked reliably, with water that ran clear and hot, in a house that felt more like a home and less like a survival challenge. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was significant enough to restore her confidence that they hadn't made a catastrophic mistake. Diego spent the morning exploring the property with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a private kingdom. He found evidence of Elena's mysterious projects everywhere: a workshop filled with strange mechanical devices, a greenhouse that had been carefully winterized and was apparently still functional, and a barn that contained tools and equipment that suggested his great-grandmother had been far more mechanically inclined than family stories had indicated. "Mom, come look at this," Diego called from the workshop, his voice carrying the excitement of discovery. Isabella found him standing before a workbench covered with what appeared to be electronic equipment: circuit boards, coils of copper wire, various measuring instruments, and notebooks filled with technical drawings and calculations in Elena's precise handwriting. "What do you think Great-Grandma was working on?" Diego asked, carefully examining a device that looked like a cross between a radio and some kind of scientific instrument. Isabella studied the notebooks, trying to decipher her grandmother's technical notes. The drawings were precise and detailed, showing what appeared to be designs for various electrical devices. The calculations were beyond her understanding, but they suggested serious engineering work rather than casual hobbyist tinkering. "I don't know," Isabella admitted, "but it looks like she was a lot more talented than anyone in the family realized." They spent the afternoon making their new home more livable, a process that revealed both the farmhouse's potential and its immediate limitations. The kitchen was spacious and well-designed, but the ancient refrigerator finally gave up completely, leaving them with a large, expensive problem. The living room was beautiful, with its stone fireplace and hardwood floors, but the windows were single-pane glass that provided minimal insulation against winter weather. Most challenging was the bathroom, which featured gorgeous vintage fixtures that required constant coaxing to function properly. The clawfoot tub was magnificent, but took 40 minutes to fill with hot water, while the toilet had personality quirks that seemed to change from hour to hour.
"It's like living in a museum," Diego observed as he watched Isabella perform the precise sequence of operations required to make the bathroom faucet produce water at the desired temperature. "A museum where nothing works quite right," Isabella agreed, but she was smiling as she said it. The evening brought their first real test of rural living when a winter storm arrived with surprising intensity. Wind howled around the farmhouse, rattling windows and sending tree branches scratching against the roof with sounds that seemed designed to unnerve city dwellers unaccustomed to nature's nighttime symphony. The electricity flickered repeatedly before finally failing completely, leaving them in darkness except for the fire in the living room and the flashlights Isabella had bought as emergency supplies. The heating system, which had been working adequately, began making new and alarming noises that suggested something important had broken or come loose. "This is actually kind of cozy," Diego said as they sat together on the living room floor, playing cards by flashlight while the storm raged outside. "Like we're pioneers or something." Isabella looked at her son, marveled at his resilience and positive attitude, and felt a surge of pride that overcame her anxiety about their circumstances. Diego was thriving in ways she hadn't expected, showing confidence and independence that had been suppressed by the cramped quarters and constant stress of their previous living situation. "You know what?" Isabella said, making a decision that surprised her even as she spoke. "You're right. We are pioneers. We're building something new here, something that belongs to us." That night, as they slept in front of the fireplace while the storm continued outside, Isabella reflected on the events of their first full day in the farmhouse. It had been challenging, sometimes frustrating, and occasionally scary. But it had also been theirs in a way that nothing had been theirs for years. The next morning brought bright sunshine and a world transformed by snow that made the property look like a scene from a Christmas card. The power had been restored sometime during the night, and the heating system was working normally again, whatever mechanical hiccup having resolved itself during the storm. More importantly, Isabella woke up feeling rested for the first time in months. The silence that had seemed eerie during their first night now felt peaceful and restorative after years of sleeping to the soundtrack of urban traffic and neighbor noise. "Mom, look outside," Diego called from the kitchen window. "Everything is beautiful." Isabella joined him at the window and was struck by the transformed landscape.
Snow covered the fields and trees, hiding the overgrown weeds and broken fences that had made the property look neglected. In the morning light, surrounded by pristine snow, the farmhouse and its outbuildings looked like they belonged in a painting of rural American life. The phone rang as they were eating breakfast, and Isabella felt the familiar anxiety that had become her automatic response to unexpected calls. But the caller ID showed Henderson Insurance, which meant work rather than crisis. "Isabella, this is Mr. Henderson. I know you said you were moving, but I wanted to check if you're still available for that data entry project we discussed. We can arrange for you to work remotely if you have reliable internet access." Isabella's heart leaped at the prospect of maintaining her income stream while establishing their new life. "Yes, I'm definitely interested. We have internet access here." This was only partially true. The farmhouse had internet service, but it was slow and unreliable by modern standards. "Excellent! I can email you the project details today, and you can start whenever you're ready. This should provide steady work for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer if the client is satisfied with the quality." After Henderson hung up, Isabella felt the first genuine optimism she'd experienced since making the decision to move to the farmhouse. They had shelter, heat, running water, and now continuing income. The basic elements of survival were in place, which meant they could focus on improvements rather than just emergency repairs. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Martha Murphy, driving her ancient Buick carefully over the rutted driveway and carrying a covered casserole dish that suggested neighborly intentions. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," Martha said, as Isabella invited her into the kitchen. "This is quite a change from living in town." "It's definitely different," Isabella agreed, appreciating the older woman's diplomatic phrasing. "But Diego loves having space to explore, and I'm enjoying the quiet." Martha looked around the kitchen with the appraising eye of someone who remembered when such houses were commonplace rather than curiosities. "Elena always kept this place nice, but she lived here like a hermit toward the end. It needs a family to bring it back to life." As Martha shared memories of Elena's later years, Isabella began to understand that her grandmother had been something of a local legend, a woman who could fix anything mechanical, who had helped neighbors with everything from tractor repairs to electrical problems, and who had pursued mysterious projects that generated speculation throughout the community. "She was always ordering strange parts through the hardware store," Martha remembered. Bill Walsh used to joke that Elena was either building a rocket ship or trying to communicate with aliens. She was brilliant, but she kept to herself. After Martha left, Diego found Isabella in Elena's workshop, examining the technical notebooks with growing fascination. The more she studied her grandmother's work, the more impressed she became with the sophistication of the projects. These weren't the casual experiments of a hobbyist, they were serious engineering efforts that suggested Elena had been working on something significant. "Maybe great-grandma left us more than just a house," Diego said, voicing the thought that had been growing in Isabella's mind all afternoon. "Maybe she did," Isabella agreed, feeling the first stirring of something that might have been hope or might have been delusion. "Maybe she left us something that could change everything." That evening, as they sat in the living room working on Diego's homework while the fire crackled peacefully in the hearth, Isabella allowed herself to believe that they had made the right choice. The farmhouse was challenging, certainly, and it would require time and money they didn't have to make it everything it could be. But it was theirs, completely and permanently theirs, in a way that nothing had been since the divorce. More importantly, Diego was flourishing in ways that had been impossible in their cramped apartment. He had space to think and explore, quiet for concentration, and the kind of stability that came from knowing they couldn't be evicted or displaced by forces beyond their control. The phone rang again as they were preparing for bed, and Isabella answered it with the cautious optimism that had begun replacing her chronic anxiety. "Isabella, this is Elizabeth Blackwood. How are you settling into your new place?" "We're doing well, Elizabeth. It's been an adjustment, but a positive one." "I'm glad to hear that. I wanted to give you a heads up that my parents have decided to postpone their custody petition for now. They're waiting to see how this move works out for Diego." Isabella felt a wave of relief so powerful it was almost physical.
The immediate threat to Diego's custody had been lifted, giving them time to establish their new life without the pressure of legal challenges. Thank you for letting me know. That takes a lot of pressure off. Just be careful, Isabella. They're still watching, still evaluating. Make sure Diego stays happy and healthy and document everything. They'll be looking for any excuse to resume their legal action. After Elizabeth hung up, Isabella found Diego reading in his room by the light of a bedside lamp, wrapped in blankets and looking more content than she'd seen him in years. "Good book?" she asked, settling on the edge of his mattress. "It's about inventors," Diego replied, showing her a biography of Thomas Edison he'd found among Elena's books. "Did you know that most of his inventions failed before he found the ones that worked?" Isabella smiled at her son's choice of reading material, wondering if it was coincidence or intuition that had drawn him to stories about persistence in the face of failure. "That's how most great things happen," she said. "You try, you fail, you learn, you try again." "Is that what we're doing here? Trying again?" Isabella looked around the room that Diego had already begun making his own, at the window that looked out over snow-covered fields, at the books that suggested her grandmother had been far more remarkable than anyone had realized. "Yes," she said, "we're trying again, and this time we're gonna make it work." The February morning that would change everything began with Diego's excited voice echoing through the farmhouse at 6:30 a.m., far earlier than any 9-year-old should be awake on a Saturday. "Mom, Mom, you have to come see this right now." Isabella stumbled from her makeshift bedroom in what had once been Elena's sewing room, pulling on a robe against the morning chill that seemed to permeate every corner of the old house despite their ongoing improvements to the heating system. She found Diego in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, standing beside the ancient refrigerator with his hands pressed against the wall behind it. "Feel this," Diego said, his eyes bright with discovery. "The wall is warm, really warm, like there's something running behind it." Isabella placed her palm against the painted plaster and immediately understood Diego's excitement. The wall was noticeably warmer than the surrounding surfaces, suggesting either a serious electrical problem or something else entirely. Given Elena's apparent expertise with unusual devices, Isabella was beginning to suspect the latter. "Maybe there's a pipe back there," she suggested, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they didn't explain the pattern of warmth that seemed to follow a specific path along the wall. "Mom, look at this." Diego had moved to examine the baseboards more closely, running his small fingers along what appeared to be a decorative wooden panel that ran the length of the kitchen wall. "This piece feels different, like it's not attached the same way as the others." Isabella knelt beside her son and examined the baseboard panel he'd identified. While the other panels were clearly original to the house's construction, this section had been added later with different wood and slightly different finishing techniques. More importantly, when she pressed gently on various points, one end of the panel shifted slightly, suggesting it wasn't permanently fixed in place.
"Should we try to move it?" Diego asked, his voice carrying the kind of careful excitement that suggested he understood they might be on the verge of discovering something significant. Isabella hesitated for a moment, weighing her natural caution against the growing certainty that Elena had left them more than just a house full of problems. Her grandmother had been too meticulous, too purposeful in everything she did for these anomalies to be accidental. "Let's see what great-grandma Elena was hiding," Isabella said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Working together, they carefully pried the loose panel away from the wall, revealing a space behind it that was clearly not part of the house's original construction. Instead of the expected tangle of pipes or electrical conduits, they found themselves looking into a small chamber that had been carved out between the wall studs and lined with what appeared to be insulation material. The chamber contained 3 metal boxes, each about the size of a shoebox, along with several thick manila envelopes wrapped in plastic bags to protect them from moisture. Everything was organized with the kind of systematic precision that Isabella was learning to associate with her grandmother's approach to any project. "What do you think is in them?" Diego whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make their discovery disappear. "Only one way to find out," Isabella replied, carefully extracting the first box from its hiding place. The box was heavier than expected and felt warm to the touch, suggesting it contained something electronic that was still active. When Isabella opened it, she found herself looking at a device that defied easy description, a collection of metallic coils, circuit boards, and what appeared to be precision-machined components, all assembled with obvious care and expertise. A small digital display on the device showed nothing to Isabella, but the steady, rhythmic pulsing of LED lights suggests that it was performing some kind of ongoing function. More intriguingly, the device was connected to cables that disappeared into the wall through carefully drilled holes, explaining the warmth they'd felt along the baseboard. "Is it some kind of heater?" Diego asked, leaning closer to examine the mysterious device. "I don't think so," Isabella said, noting that the device produced no detectable heat despite being warm to the touch. "It's doing something else entirely." The second box contained what appeared to be technical documentation: blueprints, electrical schematics, and page after page of calculations in Elena's precise handwriting. The documents were far more sophisticated than the notebook entries they'd found in the workshop, suggesting that Elena's hidden project had been the culmination of years of development work. The third box contained financial records that made Isabella's hands shake as she read through them. Bank statements showing regular deposits from something called Renewable Solutions LLC, patent filing receipts, correspondence with investors and technology companies, and most shocking of all, a letter from the U.S. Patent Office confirming the approval of patents for what was described as revolutionary electromagnetic energy harvesting and storage systems. "Mom, what does this mean?" Diego asked, studying a bank statement that showed a balance of over $200,000 in an account bearing Elena's name. Isabella's mind reeled as she tried to process what they'd discovered. Her grandmother hadn't just been a talented tinkerer, she'd been a successful inventor who had apparently created technology valuable enough to generate substantial income. The bank statements showed regular licensing payments dating back nearly 15 years, money that Elena had been earning from patents that nobody in the family had known existed. The manila envelopes contained even more shocking revelations: legal documents establishing Elena's intellectual property rights, contracts with energy companies for the licensing of her innovations, and most importantly, a will amendment that had been filed just 6 months before Elena's death, specifically bequeathing all patents and associated income streams to my granddaughter Isabella Rodriguez and her son Diego Rodriguez. "We own patents," Isabella said aloud, the words sounding impossible even as she spoke them. "Great-Grandma Elena left us patents that are worth money, real money." The fourth envelope contained a letter addressed to Isabella personally, written in Elena's familiar handwriting on stationery that bore the farmhouse address. "My dear Isabella," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have found the courage to claim your inheritance despite the doubts of others. The device you have discovered is called the Rodriguez Energy Collection System, and it represents the culmination of my life's work in developing sustainable energy solutions for ordinary families. I know this discovery must seem overwhelming, but please understand that everything I created was meant to serve people who struggle as you have struggled. The patents generate steady income because my inventions help families reduce their electricity costs while supporting grid independence. Companies pay me to use my designs because they work better than anything else currently available. The system you found has been powering this house for 12 years, reducing our electricity bills by 90% while demonstrating the practical value of the technology. The warm wall you noticed was your first clue that something unusual was happening. The energy collection process generates a small amount of heat as a byproduct of its operation. I hid this from the family because I wanted it to go to someone who would understand its true purpose and have the determination to protect it from those who might use it for pure profit rather than public benefit. You and Diego are that someone." The bank account information is included in the documentation, along with contact details for the attorney who has been managing my patent affairs. The income from these patents should provide you with the financial security you need to raise Diego properly while giving you the resources to continue developing the technology for broader application. Remember, mija, that every great innovation faces resistance from those who profit from the status quo. There will be people who want to control this technology who will try to convince you to sell it cheaply or abandon it entirely. Trust your instincts, protect what is rightfully yours, and never forget that the purpose of innovation should be helping families, not just making money for corporations. I am proud of the woman you have become and excited about the possibilities that await you and Diego. Use this gift wisely and remember that your great-grandfather would have been amazed to see his wildest dreams finally realized by his great-great-grandson. With all my love and confidence in your future, Grandmother Elena. Isabella read the letter twice, then a third time before the full implications began to sink in. Elena hadn't just left them a house, she'd left them a business, a source of ongoing income, and technology that was apparently valuable enough to attract interest from major corporations. "Mom, are we rich now?" Diego asked with the practical directness that characterized his approach to complex situations. Isabella looked at the bank statements again, noting that the most recent deposit had been made just 2 months ago, indicating that the income stream was active and ongoing. The amounts were substantial, enough to eliminate their financial stress while providing resources for improving their lives and continuing Elena's work. "We're not rich exactly," Isabella said carefully, "but we're not poor anymore either. Great-Grandma Elena made sure we'd be able to take care of ourselves." They spent the morning examining the hidden device more closely, trying to understand how it functioned and what it was actually doing. According to Elena's documentation, the Rodriguez energy collection system used a combination of electromagnetic field detection and energy conversion to harvest ambient electrical energy from radio waves, power line emissions, and atmospheric electrical activity. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of generating electricity through traditional means, the system collected energy that already existed in the environment and converted it into usable power for household applications. The device they'd found was apparently just one component of a larger system that had been integrated throughout the farmhouse structure. "So this is why our electric bills have been so low," Isabella realized, examining utility statements that showed their monthly electrical usage was approximately 20% of what it should have been for a house of this size. "Great-Grandma was really smart," Diego said, studying the technical drawings with obvious fascination. "She figured out how to get free electricity from the air." The afternoon brought a phone call that transformed their discovery from family secret to potential crisis. Isabella was reading through Elena's patent documentation when the farmhouse landline rang with its old-fashioned mechanical bell. "Is this Isabella Rodriguez?" asked a woman's voice that carried the kind of polished professionalism associated with expensive legal services. "Yes, this is Isabella. My name is Margaret Stevens from Blackwood & Associates. I represent Pinnacle Energy Corporation, and we're very interested in discussing the purchase of certain intellectual property rights that we understand you may have inherited from Elena Rodriguez." Isabella felt her stomach drop as she recognized the implications. Somehow, news of Elena's patents have reached corporate interests, probably through the normal filing processes associated with estate settlements. The technology that Elena had worked so hard to protect was already attracting the attention of people who viewed it as a commodity rather than a tool for helping families. "I'm not interested in selling anything," Isabella said firmly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't think you understand the complexity of maintaining patent rights or the legal challenges associated with defending intellectual property against larger corporations. Pinnacle Energy is prepared to offer you a very generous settlement that would eliminate all the headaches associated with this inheritance while providing you with immediate financial security." "What kind of settlement?" $2 million, cash, with all legal transfers completed within 30 days. You would be free of any ongoing obligations while receiving enough money to ensure your son's future education and your own financial independence. "I'm not interested in selling anything," Isabella said firmly. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't think you understand the complexity of maintaining patent rights or the legal challenges associated with defending intellectual property against larger corporations. Pinnacle Energy is prepared to offer you a very generous settlement that would eliminate all the headaches associated with this inheritance while providing you with immediate financial security. What kind of settlement? $2 million, cash, with all legal transfers completed within 30 days. You would be free of any ongoing obligations while receiving enough money to ensure your son's future education and your own financial independence. After hanging up, Isabella sat in Elena's workshop surrounded by the evidence of her grandmother's genius, trying to process what had just happened. $2 million was an enormous amount of money, but Elena's letter had specifically warned about people who would try to acquire the technology for purposes that didn't align with its intended use. "Who was that?" Diego asked, appearing in the workshop doorway with the sandwich he'd made himself for lunch. "Someone who wants to buy great-grandma's patents," Isabella said. "They offered us a lot of money." "Do we need a lot of money?"
Isabella considered the question seriously. They needed enough money to live comfortably and provide Diego with good opportunities, but they didn't need wealth for its own sake. More importantly, Elena had chosen to leave them the patents rather than sell them herself, suggesting she believed the technology should remain in family hands. "We need enough money, but we don't need all the money," Isabella said finally. "And I think great-grandma Elena wanted us to be the ones making decisions about how her inventions are used." That evening, as they sat in the living room reviewing Elena's documentation by firelight, Isabella began to understand the true scope of what they'd inherited. The patents covered not just the specific device they'd found, but an entire system of energy collection and storage technologies that could potentially transform how homes and businesses approached electrical power. Elena's correspondence with licensing partners showed that major energy companies were already using simplified versions of her innovations in pilot programs across the country. The royalty payments they generated suggested that widespread adoption could produce income streams far larger than Pinnacle Energy's $2 million offer. "Mom," Diego said, looking up from a technical drawing he'd been studying with obvious concentration, "I think great-grandma Elena was trying to help families like us save money on electricity. If we sell her patents to a big company, will they still help families?" The question cut to the heart of Isabella's growing concerns about the Pinnacle Energy offer. Corporations typically acquire patents either to exploit them for maximum profit or to suppress them to protect existing business models. Either approach would betray Elena's clear intention that her innovations serve working families rather than corporate shareholders. "I don't think they will," Isabella admitted. "I think they want to control the technology so they can charge people more money for it, not less. Then we shouldn't sell it to them, right?" Isabella looked at her son, marveled at his ability to see through complex situations to their essential moral components, and felt her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from knowing what was right. "Right," she said. "We're going to keep great-grandma's patents and use them the way she wanted them to be used. We're going to help families save money on their electricity bills." The phone rang again as they were preparing for bed, and Isabella answered it with growing confidence in her ability to handle whatever pressures might be brought to bear on their small family. "Isabella, this is Bill Walsh from the hardware store. I heard through the grapevine that you might have found some of Elena's old projects. If you need any help understanding what she was working on, I'd be happy to take a look. Elena and I collaborated on several technical problems over the years, and I might be able to provide some context." Isabella felt a wave of relief at the prospect of getting advice from someone who had actually known Elena and understood her work. "That would be wonderful, Bill. Could you come by tomorrow afternoon? I'll be there around 2 o'clock. And Isabella, whatever Elena left you, it's probably worth a lot more than anyone is going to tell you at first. She was brilliant, and she didn't trust corporations any further than she could throw them." As Isabella turned off the lights and settled into her own room for the night, she reflected on how completely their lives had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, they had been struggling single mother and son, making do with limited resources and uncertain prospects.
Tonight, they were the inheritors of valuable technology and steady income, with the responsibility of protecting innovations that could benefit countless families. Elena Rodriguez had been more than a grandmother. She had been a visionary who understood that true wealth came not from accumulating money, but from creating solutions that improved people's lives. Tomorrow, Isabella would begin learning how to honor that legacy while protecting it from those who would exploit it for purposes Elena never intended. The farmhouse settled around them with its familiar creaks and sighs, but now those sounds carried different meaning. This wasn't just an old house that needed repairs. It was the headquarters of a technology company, the birthplace of innovations that were already changing how people thought about energy independence, and the foundation for a future that Elena had carefully constructed for the family she loved. Outside, the February wind rattled the windows and sent tree branches scraping against the roof. But inside, surrounded by the evidence of Elena's remarkable legacy, Isabella Rodriguez felt the kind of security and purpose that no amount of money could buy. They had work to do, decisions to make, and a responsibility to fulfill that extended far beyond their own family's welfare. The hidden discovery had revealed not just valuable patents and steady income, but a mission that would define the rest of their lives.
The March morning that would determine their family's destiny began with Bill Walsh's arrival at exactly 2 p.m., carrying a toolbox and wearing the expression of someone who had spent sleepless nights thinking about Elena Rodriguez's legacy. Isabella and Diego met him at the kitchen door, both of them eager to understand the full scope of what they'd inherited. "Before we start," Bill said, setting down his tools and looking directly at Isabella with unusual seriousness, "I need you to understand that Elena trusted me with information she didn't share with anyone else in Cedar Ridge Township. What I'm about to show you will change how you see everything about your inheritance." Over the next hour, Bill transformed Isabella's understanding of the farmhouse from shelter to sophisticated laboratory. The energy collection system Diego had discovered was just the visible component of technology that had been integrated throughout the property over nearly 2 decades of careful development. Elena started small, Bill explained, as he led them through the house, pointing out modifications that had seemed like routine maintenance but were actually components of her larger system. A simple electromagnetic field detector in the workshop, then energy storage units in the basement, then collection arrays built into the roof structure and foundation systems. In the basement, behind what appeared to be routine electrical panels, Bill revealed banks of battery storage units that maintained the farmhouse's energy independence even during extended power outages. The system was elegant and comprehensive, capable of providing complete electrical autonomy while generating excess power that was quietly sold back to the regional grid. "This is why your electric bills have been so low," Bill said, showing the monitoring equipment that tracked energy production, storage, and consumption in real time. "Elena's system has been generating more power than the house uses, and the utility company has been paying her for the excess." "How much money are we talking about?" Isabella asked, trying to process the implications of what she was seeing. Bill consulted a logbook that Elena had maintained with characteristic precision. Based on these records, the farmhouse system has generated approximately $18,000 in excess power sales over the past 3 years, while reducing your electrical costs by about 95%. But that's just this one installation. The revelation that hit Isabella like a physical blow came when Bill showed them Elena's correspondence with energy companies about licensing larger versions of her technology. The patents didn't just cover household-scale systems, they included designs for commercial and industrial applications that could transform how businesses approached energy costs. Elena was conservative about expansion because she wanted to perfect the technology before scaling up, Bill explained, but companies like Pinnacle Energy have been pressuring her for years to license rights for large-scale implementation. The market potential is enormous. Diego had been following the technical explanations with obvious fascination, and now he asked the question that cut to the heart of their situation. If great-grandma's inventions are so valuable, why did that company only offer us $2 million?
Bill's expression darkened. Because $2 million is pocket change compared to what these patents are actually worth. Elena's technology could disrupt the entire energy industry if it's implemented properly. Companies like Pinnacle want to acquire the patents cheaply so they can either exploit them for maximum profit or suppress them to protect their existing business models. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Margaret Stevens, the attorney representing Pinnacle Energy, who arrived unannounced in a black sedan that looked out of place among the rural surroundings. Isabella watched through the kitchen window as the woman emerged from her car wearing an expensive suit and the confident expression of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to discuss our offer in person," Stevens said. "Have you had time to consider Pinnacle Energy's proposal?" "I've decided not to sell," Isabella replied firmly, noting how the woman's eyes quickly scanned the visible portions of the farmhouse interior as if cataloging evidence of their financial situation. "I understand your hesitation, but I don't think you fully appreciate the challenges associated with maintaining patent rights against larger corporations. The legal costs alone could bankrupt most families, even before considering the complexity of managing licensing agreements and defending against patent challenges." Stevens stepped closer, her voice taking on the kind of reasonable tone that Isabella had learned to distrust. "Pinnacle Energy is prepared to increase our offer to $3 million, with immediate payment and complete assumption of all legal responsibilities. You would be free to focus on raising your son without the burden of managing complex intellectual property." Before Isabella could respond, Diego appeared at his side with the kind of perfect timing that suggested he'd been listening from just inside the house. "Why do you want to buy our patents so much?" Diego asked, with the direct curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions weren't supposed to be asked. Stevens looked momentarily flustered by Diego's intervention, but quickly recovered her professional composure. "Because your great-grandma created valuable technology, and Pinnacle Energy has the resources to develop it properly for public benefit." "But if you develop it for public benefit, won't families save money on their electricity bills?" "Well, yes, eventually, but—"
"Then why don't you just pay us money every month instead of buying the patents? That way, families still save money, and we still get to help them like great-grandma wanted." Isabella felt a surge of pride at her son's logic, but more importantly, she recognized that Diego had identified the fundamental flaw in Stevens' argument. If Pinnacle Energy truly intended to use Elena's technology for public benefit, they would be willing to pay ongoing royalties rather than seeking outright ownership. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Stevens said, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal underlying frustration, "I really must insist that you consider this offer seriously. Patent disputes can become very complicated, and families who refuse reasonable settlements sometimes find themselves facing legal challenges that are difficult to manage." The implicit threat in Stevens' words crystallized Isabella's resolve. Elena had specifically warned about people who would try to pressure them into selling cheaply, and Stevens was following that script exactly. "I think you should leave," Isabella said, quietly but firmly. "We're not interested in selling, and we're not intimidated by threats disguised as advice." After Stevens departed, Bill Walsh emerged from the workshop where he'd been discreetly observing the interaction. His expression was grim as he watched the black sedan disappear down the gravel road. "That confirms my suspicions about Pinnacle Energy," Bill said. "They're not interested in public benefit. They want to control Elena's technology so they can either monetize it ruthlessly or suppress it entirely." The evening brought a phone call that would change everything. Isabella was reviewing Elena's patent documentation when the farmhouse landline rang with unusual urgency. "Isabella, this is Dr. Patricia Morrison from the Sustainable Energy Research Institute at State University. I've been following Elena Rodriguez's work for several years, and I understand you've inherited her patents. I'd like to discuss a proposition that might interest you." Unlike the corporate representatives they'd been dealing with, Dr. Morrison's approach was collaborative rather than acquisitive. She explained that the university had been developing complementary technologies that could enhance Elena's innovations while maintaining their focus on helping ordinary families achieve energy independence.
Elena corresponded with our research team occasionally, and we've been hoping to establish a partnership that would allow her technology to reach its full potential while preserving her intention to serve working families rather than just corporate profits. Dr. Morrison's proposal was elegant in its simplicity. The university would provide legal, technical, and business development support in exchange for research collaboration and modest licensing fees. Isabella would retain full ownership of Elena's patents while gaining access to resources that could protect and expand their applications. This would allow you to honor your grandmother's vision while ensuring the technology reaches as many families as possible, Dr. Morrison explained. We're not interested in buying your patents. We want to help you develop them responsibly. Isabella felt the first stirring of hope that they might be able to navigate the complex world of patent management without sacrificing Elena's principles or their family's financial security. The following week brought a succession of developments that confirmed they were moving in the right direction. Dr. Morrison arrived at the farmhouse with a team of graduate students who were amazed by the sophistication of Elena's installations and eager to document and expand her innovations. Your grandmother was at least a decade ahead of current research in electromagnetic energy, Dr. Morrison told Isabella as they toured the property together. These patents represent the foundation for technology that could revolutionize how we approach renewable energy. More importantly, the university's legal team confirmed that Elena's patents were far more valuable than Pinnacle Energy's offers had suggested. Conservative estimates place their worth at between $50 and $100 million, if developed properly, with potential for even greater value as energy markets evolve towards sustainability. The key is developing the technology gradually while maintaining control over how it's implemented, the university's patent attorney explained. Elena understood that rushing to market with revolutionary technology often results in corporate capture and exploitation. Diego thrived in the environment of academic collaboration, asking sophisticated questions about energy physics and demonstrating an intuitive understanding of Elena's engineering principles that impressed the graduate students. Isabella began to see her son not just as a bright child, but as someone who might carry Elena's legacy forward into the next generation. The breakthrough that would secure their future came when Dr. Morrison's team successfully scaled up Elena's household system for commercial application. The pilot installation at a local manufacturing plant reduced their energy costs by 70% while generating enough excess power to supply 30 nearby homes. This proves that Elena's technology is ready for broader implementation, Dr. Morrison announced at a meeting in the farmhouse kitchen that had become their informal headquarters. We can begin licensing to carefully selected partners while maintaining oversight to ensure the technology serves its intended purpose. Within 6 months, the Rodriguez Energy Foundation had been established, with Isabella as director and Diego as the youngest board member in foundation history. The organization's mission was simple: develop and distribute Elena's innovations in ways that prioritized family welfare over corporate profits.
The first commercial licensing agreements generated enough income to eliminate every financial worry Isabella had ever experienced, while providing resources for expanding Elena's technology to communities that needed it most. Rural cooperatives, low-income housing developments, and family farms became early adopters of systems that dramatically reduced their energy costs while demonstrating the broader potential of Elena's innovations. Great-grandma would be proud, Diego said one evening as they reviewed reports from installations across 3 states that were helping hundreds of families save money on their electricity bills. Isabella looked around the farmhouse that had been transformed from burden to headquarters, at the workshop where Elena's legacy continued to evolve through ongoing research and development, and at her son who was already showing signs of inheriting his great-grandmother's innovative spirit. The final vindication came when Pinnacle Energy's true intentions were revealed through investigative reporting that exposed their pattern of acquiring promising energy patents only to suppress them in favor of protecting traditional utility business models. The company faced federal investigation for anti-competitive practices, while the Rodriguez Foundation received recognition for advancing genuine innovation in renewable energy.
"We made the right choice," Isabella said, as she and Diego stood in Elena's workshop, surrounded by equipment that had once seemed mysterious but now represented hope for families struggling with energy costs across the country. "I think Great-Grandma knew we would," Diego replied with the wisdom that had guided him throughout their journey. "She trusted us to do the right thing." As the sun set over the fields that had once seemed like nothing but overgrown weeds, Isabella reflected on the transformation that had brought them from desperate poverty to purposeful prosperity. Elena Rodriguez had left them more than patents and income. She had left them a mission that gave their lives meaning beyond material success. The farmhouse that everyone had dismissed as worthless had become the birthplace of technology that was changing how families approached energy independence. The woman who had been mocked for believing in her grandmother's legacy had become the director of a foundation that proved innovation could serve people rather than just profit. Most importantly, the boy who had started this journey sleeping on a pull-out couch in a cramped apartment was growing up in an environment where curiosity was rewarded, where family values guided important decisions, and where he could see daily proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they refused to give up on their dreams. The hidden $100 million secret hadn't just been Elena's patents, it had been her faith that future generations would have the courage and wisdom to use her innovations for their intended purpose. Isabella and Diego had proved that faith was justified, and in doing so, they had honored not just Elena's memory, but the best possibilities of what inheritance could mean when combined with determination, principle, and love. Outside the farmhouse windows, the March evening settled over Cedar Ridge Township with the promise of spring and new growth. Inside, mother and son planned the next phase of their work, to expand Elena's technology to families who needed it most, secure in the knowledge that they were building something that would benefit generations to come. The struggling single mother who had been mocked for inheriting a junk farmhouse had become the leader of a revolution in sustainable energy, proving that sometimes the most valuable gifts come disguised as burdens, and that the greatest treasures are discovered not by those who seek wealth, but by those who refuse to abandon hope. Isabella and Diego Rodriguez continued their work with the Rodriguez Energy Foundation, which grew to become one of the nation's leading developers of accessible renewable energy technology. Diego graduated from State University with degrees in electrical engineering and business administration, eventually taking over leadership of the foundation his great-great-grandmother had made possible. By his 30th birthday, Elena Rodriguez's innovations had helped over 100,000 families achieve energy independence, while generating sustainable income that supported educational programs for young inventors from low-income families. The farmhouse in Cedar Ridge Township became a National Historic Landmark, preserved as a testament to the power of innovation guided by compassion and the importance of family legacies that extend beyond material wealth. Elena's workshop was converted into a museum and research center, where visitors could learn about the intersection of technology and social responsibility. And in the quiet moments between foundation meetings and patent applications and licensing negotiations, Isabella would sometimes sit in Elena's old kitchen and remember the morning when Diego had discovered the warm wall that changed everything, grateful for the courage that had allowed them to see possibilities where others saw only problems.